So in this video, I want to go through the basic building blocks and take a step back to how Microsoft used to license productivity in the past. So in the past, before the cloud was generally available, Microsoft, as you obviously know, used to sell a lot of productivity software that you would need to install on your own devices, in your own data centers, on your own servers. And to unlock the functionality, you would require to have certain access rights or software on the devices within your organization to be able to leverage the productivity tooling that Microsoft offered. And this was called the Pro or Enterprise Desktop. So whereas Microsoft now calls it Microsoft 365, E3 or E5, for instance, in the enterprise sense, you used to have something called the Professional or Enterprise Desktop in the olden days, not that long ago. Maybe some companies even still use it, though potentially most Microsoft customers might have shifted to the cloud right now. In the olden days, the Professional Desktop and the Enterprise Desktop consisted of 3 building blocks as well. And these building blocks translated to Microsoft's 365 offering. So it's important to understand where this comes from, how it evolved, and what aspects of that old desktop suite of software products and how that translates to the cloud version of it, and why we will get to that in a later stage when we're going to talk about, for instance, from SA licensing. The Pro and Enterprise Desktop consisted of a core client access license suite in the case of the Professional Desktop, or an Enterprise client access license suite in the case of the Enterprise Desktop. The other building blocks were Office Professional Plus and the Windows Upgrade license, which was a per device license. Office Professional Plus also was a device license, which meant that you need to install that on your primary device. So it's not a user subscription license, but it was a device license. The Core or Enterprise CAL suite could either be a device license or a user license, meaning that you could assign it to a user and they could use the functionality of those CAL suites on all the devices, or you could be having that as a device license, which would mean that you could give those suites to that device and they could benefit from the functionality on that device. Now, what was a Core and Enterprise CAL suite? We've talked about as in other videos, so we would be sure to link this here. But the Core and Enterprise CAL suite basically consists of functionality to access certain server functionality. So it's a client access license. A client access license is the right of a user or a device to access a certain functionality on a server. So what would typically be included here would be Windows Server client access licenses, Exchange on-premise access licenses, SharePoint server access licenses, Skype for Business access licenses, and things like System Center Configuration Manager, etc. Why were there 2 flavors? So there was one for basic functionality. They had functional differences, so you would get less use rights within a core CAL license suite for Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Skype for Business, whereas in the Enterprise suite, you would get more functionality. For instance, you would get voicemail access in the eCal suite. You wouldn't get that for Exchange in the core CAL suite. How does this translate? Within Microsoft 365, obviously, you see a lot of business productivity functionality being included in Office 365. You see a lot of security functionality being included in Enterprise Mobility. Well, in the past, that would be within the Core or Enterprise CAL suite. So you have to make a distinction between those two, so that the infrastructure components for the core CAL suite, meaning Windows Server CAL, Configuration Manager CAL, other kinds of CALs that were included there, would be moved to the Enterprise Mobility and Security suite. So if you buy an EMS license, for instance, you can access your on-premise servers because it has the Windows Server Client Access License rights included in it. Whereas things like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, for instance, which are in Office 365 E3 and E5, would generally translate to another part of the Core CAL and eCal suite. Within Office 365, obviously, you get the installation rights for all the Office apps, which would translate to Office Professional Plus, and the Windows E3 or E5 license, that's a per user license, would translate in the old days to the Windows Upgrade device license. So Windows switched to a per user model, but it's still software and it's still the same as it was back in the old school licensing days of on-premise licensing. So as you can see as well with Microsoft 365, in the on-premise licensing, there's a lot of different models available, never one size fits all. With cloud licensing, this become even more apparent. So with all the different flavors, with all the different suites, with all the different components that are included in Microsoft 365, you have a lot of option to play around with it. Do I buy a smaller suite and add components on top of that? What do I do with people that work under the frontline user perspective, so don't have a primary device, for instance? How do I license those? So with Microsoft 365, that has become even bigger than it used to be. So a one-size-fits-all is definitely not what we propose anymore, whereas it used to be the way to go in buying a pro and enterprise desktop for most of the people in your organization. In a later video, we're going to talk about client access license equivalent licensing, something that I tried to explain a little bit here as well, where we say that, for instance, a Windows Server client access license, right, is included in enterprise mobility and security. That's called CAL equivalent licensing. If you want to know more about that, we'll link that here, or you just follow this training course and you will get there eventually.